Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future, our regular commission meeting. Martin Heft, Undersecretary of Policy and Management, and co-chair. Hopefully that's not my.
If you're in the room, please mute your computer. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. Unfortunately, Representative Jason Rojas will not be with us today. Just to confirm our attendance that we do have a quorum, Mr. Clerk.
I believe we currently have 17 in the room.
Thank you very much. With that, we will move on to the approval of the January 9th, 2023 minutes. And just as a reminder, if you are speaking or making a motion, to please turn your video on if you're online and identify yourself. So we'll take a motion for the January 9th, 2023 minutes.
So moved.
Thank you, Representative. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, David. Is there any corrections, changes, additions to the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Then the minutes are passed. So thank you very much. Moving on to our working group presentations. Month of February, we have model code and design development. And I just want to double check if Representative Zulu is on, but I do not see him. So I wanted to just make sure before. Okay. So our working group members co-chaired by Representative Zulu and David Barkin. So David, I'm going to turn this over to you for our presentation today.
Great, thank you. So David Barkin, I'm the DAS designee on the CCDF and co-chair with Representative Zulu of the Model Code Working Group. We had a very active group throughout the 2022. I can't say exactly how many times we met, but I would say 6, 7, 8 times. We went through first, I would say a learning, together learning what the issues were surrounding the statutory language around the Model Code Working Group. Today, I'm going to review the broad recommendations that we're making, and we're going to have 2 very interesting presentations. The first from Leslie Crean regarding smart code concepts, I call it, and the second from Francis Pickering regarding presentation of street design concepts. And I'll ask each of them to present to introduce themselves when they make their respective presentations. Next slide, please. I don't know if you want to go to the presentation. Just so everybody can read it easier. Yeah, next slide, please. And yeah, there we go. So per the Public Act, we were given sort of 5 charges, and they're listed. I'm not going to read them. I would say that we had a very diverse group of viewpoints in the working group. And I think that benefited us because there was quite a bit of discussion with our final report as to language, the eventual recommendations, and I feel, sort of proud and confident that we've approached the subject thoroughly, and have the following recommendations broadly to make. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Will. I mean, in essence, what we need to do is create this template for use by towns and municipalities for both providing a model code for potential adoption. And in order to do that effectively, covering the gamut from an urban environment to exurban, rural, is a big task. And number one is we're going to need funding from the legislature to engage a consultant or multiple consultants to help us develop these model guidelines. And one of, I think, the second equally important recommendation that we have is to provide resources to municipalities that would enhance land use planning capacity and provide a way of assistance in implementing any models that we put out there. So we feel it would be most advantageous to have those resources focused through the Office of Responsible Growth at the Office of Policy and Management. They could develop support and incentives to help improve planning practices in Connecticut, including the adoption of model code guidelines by the local governments. This could facilitate sharing of land use best practices and facilitate incorporation of best practices into municipal regulation standards and processes, and then improve coordination to support effective and efficient plan implementation. These are summary statements. Our report goes into greater detail that we provided in December. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce first Leslie Crean, who is our planner from Groton, and she can give us additional introductions, and then provide us a presentation on the I say Smart Code 9.2, but I actually believe that Leslie's presentation is a little bit broader than that. So could you join us, please? Do we want her? Leslie, you could come up? Yeah.
Take any seat.
That desk right there would be ideal.
Right. The desk there.
Yes, right there.
Just bear with us one moment as we get this set up.
Excuse me. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak. My name is Leslie Crean. I am the city planner for the city of Groton, and I have worked in several other municipalities in the state of Connecticut, among other places. So I had a great time working with the group of people that volunteered their time to tackle a very complicated subject. Zoning used to be a whole lot easier. It was just, you can do this here and you can't do it here. It's gotten much more complex, much more intuitive and finessed. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about today. Basically, in addition to the historic idea of regulating uses and where you can do things and where you can't, and sort of the, old-fashioned first grade, you can sit here, but you can't sit here. You can do this, but you can't do that methodology. We have fortunately evolved, and we understand that how places are constructed, how they're maintained, how they are, the scale that they're built at the human scale, not the, third floor and above, but below that, where people actually feel their place, has become increasingly important. And we've seen many sociological studies and the evidence of how those placemaking efforts can affect families, neighborhoods, cities, and everything sociological and economic that goes with that, as well as the physical. So what I really want to emphasize is that zoning should be about creating great places. Now, not every place has to be great, because if every place was great, you couldn't tell one from the other, but we shouldn't have anything less than good. And we can do that. We know how to do that. But in a state where we have 169 different municipalities of one sort or another, some of them don't have planning staff. Some of them don't have the ability to do the things that larger municipalities can. It becomes complex, it becomes difficult, and in some cases it becomes impossible. I will say that despite what any normal person might say, I do truly believe that planning and zoning can be the most fun that you can have in terms of contributing to one's social and physical atmosphere. A lot of it has to do with circulation, and not exactly this kind, but ways of getting from here to there. And if you look at the circulatory system of a municipality, you'll see that it generally has a center, and this is typical of most New England cities and towns. It generally has a center, and then it sort of becomes spider-like. It gets a little looser around the edges as it then connects to the looser edges of the next municipality. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So there's a place for that sort of dense development, and then it loosens up and then it tightens up again. The question is, how does that happen? How can we make those connections in the best way possible for the people that live and work there? So Holly White once said, and it's one of my favorite quotes, that it's difficult to design a space that will not attract people. What is remarkable is how often it's done. There are so many places that we can go to in this country where people don't want to be, and they tend to be places that are not built at human scale. If you go to, and I'm just using these as examples, but if you go to a city where you have older buildings that are sort of a townhouse format with stoops and places where people can sit close to the street, you're going to see people engaging that space. If you go to a place that has a huge plaza like the one on the screen here, where you're not sure if it's supposed to be there for vehicles or people or kids to run around or no one to exist in. It's very confusing. And we make those, we look at how confusing or not confusing, how obvious a space's use is meant to be by how we feel in it. So compared to the picture that was on the screen a moment ago of an empty plaza, here is a place where if you saw it without the additions by people who are occupying the space, the public art, the places to sit, the pathways for bikes and scooters and rollerblades, the all abilities access to this space, the mix of adults and children. The fact that it is underneath a highway overpass almost becomes irrelevant because they've conquered the space with things that represent human comfort. And by moving plants where they are, putting seating areas where they are, and the juxtaposition of all of those things, those are the things that create that human scale. And there are many different ways to do that. Making a place pretty may sound silly and it may sound obvious, but people like to be in pretty places. They like to be in a park where there are blossoms and flowers and where it smells good and where they can see from one end to the other. And making places fun. Sitting on a sidewalk in the middle of a city, or now they've even pushed it further out, you can actually have, they're called parklets, where you can have reserve parking spaces. Restaurants can reserve parking spaces in front of their restaurants and they can put seating there. It's fun. It's great people watching. And it feels like a safe place. These are two examples of different ways to design space. One is highly designed, I would argue highly regulated in terms of the space and what it takes up, versus less regulated. Park is, you can run around, you can kick a ball, you can sit, fly a kite, whatever. So some examples of public spaces, just the basics. Streets are public spaces, parks are public spaces, playgrounds, band shells, government offices, public land. But parking lots, public or private, gas stations, street corners, cafes, sidewalks, beaches, those are all public spaces as well, and we treat them very differently. So this is what zoning can give us. Can write zoning regulations so that this is pretty much what you get. The gas station owner is going to maximize the amount of signage that they're allowed to use. So if you let them use an enormous amount of signage, they will use it. If you have 5 of these in a row, it's really hard to tell who's charging what for the gas. This is also what a gas station could look like. And this image is sort of famously known as gas backwards. And it has the gas pumps in the back of a small general store that's the same as the little store that you have in the previous slide, and at any gas station, certainly in Connecticut, most of them have the, place where you can go in and get a candy bar or a bottle of water, whatever. So the uses are exactly the same. But the design, the form of the buildings, where that building sits on that property in relation to the street, that's what makes the difference between those two. The signage, if you look at the signage is actually much easier to read. The iconography of the previous slide, one might argue, is very clear. you look at that, you know it's a gas station. And even though one might argue that the little store in the back is a little bit harder to see, you're pretty sure it's there. In this image, it's very clear where the market is. If you live in that area, if you drive on those roadways, you know there's a gas station there. So controlling for form and the placement of buildings, this is what typical zoning in Connecticut allows. And, you know, we could play the game of, does anybody know where this is? But it doesn't really matter because it's everywhere and it could be anywhere. I used to drive through this intersection dozens of times a day. And everything here is the way that it is because we have said this is how it has to be. So if we can look at changing how we say something has to be, we can make things look different, make things look more comfortable, make things look safer for people and pedestrians and bicyclists. So there are use-based codes, which is what we're used to. That is what most municipalities have in Connecticut. Some municipalities in Connecticut have adopted hybrid codes for the most part that are partially, they sort of take the best from form-based code and they take the best from use-based codes. Use-based codes are what you can do, what you can't do, and how to do it. Form-based codes are, they regulate use, but they look at use as being something that changes over time behind a facade of a building, allowing that change to occur so that you can have that change be something that is, you don't have to take the building down every time some new tenant moves in. You can have a lawyer's office, you can have a residential space, you can go back to, you know, an accountant's office or a medical office, back and forth. And you still have, you're not disrupting the architectural character of the facade or of the street as a whole. If you look at the image on the left, I know it's fuzzy and I sort of mean it to be not where you can't, anybody wants to see what it really says, happy to do that. But the idea is that you can fit most of the regulations for a single zone on a single page with form-based code. Okay, it's very different from dozens of pages with use-based code. And it's very specific about how far a building can be from the street and how close it has to be. So it gives you numbers for both directions. How high it can be as viewed from the street. What defines places that people occupy? If we look at zoning instead of what you can do and what you can't do as being the first and foremost rule we apply, and look at where do people want to be and how can we create that place? This is a map of Savannah, Georgia, and you see the pattern of the green squares in the image on the left. And then you see what it's like on the ground in the image on the right. You see that people actually have places to sit. There are benches there. It's a place where the area that surrounds those parks creates a sense of community, a sense of neighborhood. Even if people don't know each other, they recognize each other. It creates opportunities for serendipitous meetings with your neighbor, with somebody you don't know, but now you do because, you know, your dog jumped over their foot or whatever. So again, the idea of human scale, even though there are 3, 4, and 5-story buildings surrounding this. Aspects of really great public spaces, we know what they are. The question is, can we make our zoning regulations allow us to actually use them? So human scale design, visibility, having eyes on the street, make for much safer places, creating edges so people don't feel like they are just sort of falling off the side of a place. Creating linkages. Those linkages should be things that are available to people. Yes, by car. Form-based code is not anti-car, but making places able to be linked by walkability, by bikeability. Again, I heard somebody today call it rollerability. Try to work that into my vocabulary. So you can use scooters, you can have rollerblades, things like that. Places to sit that are meant to be sat on. There was a time when that people were taking benches out of bus stops because some people would sleep there. Like that was the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen. That someone would elect to sleep on a bench in a bus stop. Which is going to get me to another point in a moment. Creating view corridors where if you look down the street, you see something that is that terminates your vista. Often it's a house of worship or a civic building of some other sort. If you look at, if you're in DC and you look up a few streets, you'll see the Capitol, or you will see it's designed so that you see the Washington Monument or the White House. And then again, back to the idea of serendipity, that little bit of fun at what you're not sure is around the corner. And these images are all, we can find these places anywhere. The question is, can we enhance them so that they feel like you're meant to be there? And that's one of the things that we don't always have. So form-based codes, just to be very clear, they're not a lot of things. They're not the be-all, end-all. They don't answer every question. They're not a cookie cutter solution. But what they are, they're not anti-car, but they are pro-walking. They are pro-biking. They are pro-human-centered design. They're not anti-use, but they are pro-mixed use, but not everywhere. They are pro-appropriate uses. They are pro-change of use over time, allowing for the changes to happen within the building without having to take a building down. They're pro-human scale. They're not one size fits all. They need to be calibrated. They're different everywhere. So applying a form-based code in a rural community within Connecticut is going to look very different and use different tools than applying it in, say, downtown Milford or downtown Waterbury. Another thing that it gives you the opportunity to do, because you're looking at more than a single lot at a time, is it allows you to look at the ability to fairly distribute public amenities. And that's something that I think is going to become more and more of an issue. So planning for critical adjacencies of use. Venn diagrams are my very favorite shape. They include the complexities and also all of those serendipitous connections that can make a place really great. But it's not just use. You have to establish a place that will accept other things, such as making a place that is safe for children, that is safe for elderly, that are safe and allows all of those populations to inhabit that space together. Another Venn diagram, you can look at a place, does it allow for new infrastructure or continued use of existing infrastructure, to address climate change, to address traffic management. How can you look at all of those things at the same time that you're looking at whatever happens to be the first one? And the last one, I could make these forever, but the last one that I'll show you. We talk about housing, particularly affordable housing, but housing in general, economic development and civic responsibility. And those are all in the news a lot these days. We can make places that address those three things together, and they strengthen each other by having housing where you have housing that is comfortable for families to live in, for people that work from home, for people who are retired and tend to be home, for people who want to get have the ability to be able to go walk to a corner store, to a museum, to a library branch, all of those things. They all combine with civic responsibility. These are people who are keeping an eye on the neighborhood. They'll know when something isn't quite right. And they'll be there to at least get help if they can't afford help themselves. Not to mention great relationships, wonderful friends. It doesn't all have to be centered around bad or difficult news. So this is an example of why form matters. We have a lot of strip malls in Connecticut, and almost by definition, they require you to drive to them. Many of them do not have sidewalks that lead up to them. Many of them have a number of curb cuts, which make it difficult for pedestrians to get to them or to get by them. I often say that corners are holy. In the image on the right, you'll see that the space that occupies the corner of that lot is a parking lot. When I talked earlier about edges and the importance of edges in defining spaces, that is an example. This is an example of sort of a space kind of falling off the edge of the street. It doesn't feel safe to pedestrians. It doesn't feel safe to somebody who is doing anything other than driving their SUV into a parking lot where they have to park without hitting the car next to them. Good form can be really beautiful and striking. And it's not just pretty pictures in watercolor. They're real places. They can really be built. They used to be really be built because they were built before we had things that measured how we occupy space in car distance and car scale. They used to be built based on human scale. We know that having large windows on a storefront makes it so that people will feel safe walking by it. People will not feel safe. We know this. People will not feel safe walking by more than 30 feet of a solid wall. They'll stop and turn around. Tools for creating and enhancing and preserving great places. So we have the plan of conservation and development in every municipality. In many municipalities, it is what I sometimes refer to as an 8-pound doorstop. People do it, they send it into OPM and then they forget about it. Other municipalities use it actually very responsibly and go back and update it, even within the 10-year period. And then, but it's the big vision piece. It's the, what do we dream of? Land use regulation should be the implementation tool for that vision. But we have to write it so that that's in fact what it does. So zoning regulations, we know what we get when it's strictly use-based. We have an idea from other places what we can get if it's generally strictly form-based. We also know that there are places that have, and particularly in Connecticut, the ones that have been implemented, the hybrids of taking the best of form-based and the best of use-based and putting them together and calibrating them for each municipality. Each municipality still gets to do their own zoning regulations, but they get to figure out what works for them. Other tools that are available are, in addition to the POCD, are subdivision regulations and street design, which Francis will be speaking about. Use-based zoning tools are maps that don't have a real sense of logic to them. They are the, you can do this over here and that over there, but you can't do them together. And they tend to be many inches thick, which developers find foreboding. So you have less economic development. Form-based codes are based upon what was done as a biological transect originally, where you look at the plant life and animal life of from the sea to the mountains and how they gradually, incrementally change. It's the same thing with form-based codes. We look at, from open space to, something like downtown Hartford and all of the incremental changes in between those. How can we make those happen in the best way for all of the residents of Connecticut? So what zoning can do, again, uses. Can I put a restaurant here? Plain and simple, yes or no. How big can it be? Can I have an outdoor cafe? Yes or no answers typically. With form, you look at where am I supposed to put my building so that it works with other buildings? How high can it be? Where can I park? Where can't I park? What zoning cannot do is it can't regulate aesthetics and style. It can't say your building has to be Gothic. We're not allowed to do that. It can't control behavior. That's what the police do. And traffic, streets are actually not within the jurisdiction of zoning regulations unless they're subdivisions or private streets. So when I talk about edges and being able to design edges in order to create great streets, it's a way of doing, it's a way of massaging that relationship. Great streets are made of great edges. Here's in this slide, an example of the public realm. If you take out all but one building, pick a building that you want to keep and take everything else out, the feel of this space changes dramatically. You can do this anywhere. This is just a photograph I happen to have. Same thing here. Find the places that are working where people are, because if people are there, they want to be there, generally speaking. Find out why they're there. What are they there for? What do they enjoy? What don't they enjoy? Find out what's working. I did take out the photo of a tape measure, but the tape measure is your best friend. Measure distances, the distance between the facade of a building and the edge of a sidewalk. If it feels right, if it feels too tight, find out what that number is. But that's what we do when we do zoning. We use those numbers. Form-based codes are based upon people who studied those numbers. They went out and they actually did it in New England initially. And then recognize what doesn't work. Putting a huge parking lot in the middle with all the stores in the back basically mandates that you have to get there by car. It's not a comfortable place to walk. And if you want to go to the store on one corner of that building to a store in the other corner of that building, it's also, you then have to take the long way or walk the hypotenuse between the two, and it's a longer, dangerous walk. You're walking through a parking lot, which is kind of the definition of it's not so safe. Okay, I won't read through all of these things, but there's so much more to discuss. There's so much more to this topic. And I am always happy to do that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you and give you a summary of what we talked about in our working group and the things we would like to see be able to be studied for the different municipalities in the state of Connecticut. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thanks for the informative presentation. And, I think one thing that gets lost in this discussion is that we do think that there's a connection between this and affordability. And it's even though this isn't necessarily to solve all affordability issues, we feel that these kinds of zoning solutions could provide those kinds of opportunities for better development that would address and help solve some of those housing issues in the future. And anyhow, I'd like to turn this over now to Francis Pickering, is director of WestCog, and allow him to proceed. But thanks again, Leslie. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, David. As David said, I'm Francis Pickering, Executive Director of the Western Connecticut Council of Governments, one of the 9 regional councils of government serving the state of Connecticut. Leslie spoke very eloquently as to the importance and power of zoning. However, as she astutely pointed out, zoning is not the only policy that influences what our communities look like, how they perform, and what they cost. There are very important factors driving development cost, not just to developers, but also to eventual buyers, whether they're commercial or residential, and to the sustainability of our communities. Public Act 2129 included a directive to look at street design. Street design is often left out of the discussion. We focus a lot on zoning. We also focus on architecture. We don't often look down at our own feet and look what we're walking on. So I have about 15 years experience in transportation planning, and I volunteered to help the commission and the work group look at how we can improve our communities for a more sustainable, resilient, and diverse future through street design. Connecticut has a history of looking at street design. Currently, we design our streets what's called the Connecticut Highway Design Manual. It is it's maintained by the Connecticut Department of Transportation. It's a relatively comprehensive document. It was last released in 2003 and updated through 2020. And it's really designed to, or intended to provide the geometric specifications for facilities that serve through traffic and predominantly motor vehicles, so cars. There have been additions and augmentations to it for pedestrians, cyclists, and other vulnerable users, but it was never conceived of as a design manual for local streets, the streets that our neighborhoods are on. And some people do live on through streets, but neighborhood streets, local streets are really in a category apart from the hierarchical road network that the Federal Highway Administration oversees and that we fund for transportation purposes, for moving people and goods. Many municipalities, however, defer to the Connecticut Highway Design Manual because they don't have their own design manuals. And designing one is not an easy task. And that's why the commission here didn't design one. We, I would say in recognition, it's before my time, of the challenges of using a design manual that's intended for highways, for local streets, the General Assembly directed the Connecticut Department of Transportation to come up with a design manual for subdivision streets called the Guidelines for Subdivision Streets. This was released in 1987. It's not been updated since then. We have new consciousness about many things, including safety and climate change since 1987. And frankly, it's unclear whether this document is being used by anybody. If you open the document, look at it, many of the standards they seem somewhat dated. They really are designed to build very wide roads, very large cul-de-sacs that are far in excess of what is needed for neighborhood traffic. Most recently, AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, released a set of guidelines for the geometric design of local low-volume roads. It's not bad guidance, but generally municipalities in Connecticut defer to the Connecticut Highway Design Manual. One of the reasons we're looking at this, and it caught my eye in particular, was that the price of a road depends upon how big the road is, just like a house. We've seen over the last about 50 years, home values have tracked home sizes almost perfectly. Home sizes double, home costs double for construction. Looking at this on the screen ahead of you, it may be too small, my apologies, but I asked our in-house transportation engineers, about 40 years of experience working for the federal government, Department of Transportation at the state, University Transportation Institutes, and the COGS to estimate the costs of building a 10-house subdivision street in 3 different communities. One community using more generous standards, one using more conservative standards, and one using middle of the road standards. And we found that the cost of this 10-house street, just the street alone and its appurtenances, lighting, sidewalks, curbs, etc., range from $55,000 to $867,000. Now, factoring in that this is a 10-home street, that means the cost to each buyer there, assuming no developer profit, is between $5,500 and $87,000 per unit. I think it becomes pretty clear very fast that how we size our infrastructure has a real impact on the cost of our housing and the cost of development. I would like to just distinguish what I'm addressing here a bit from what Leslie talked about. The places Leslie talked about, these public spaces, these mixed use environments are wonderful, but the majority of Americans live in areas that currently are zoned single use. And the question is, can every place be multi-use, mixed use? Probably not. We still will, regardless of how much we pursue mixed use, see, I would believe, a predominance of neighborhoods. They may be zoned multiple use or multi-use or mixed use, but de facto, they'll be largely comprising housing. In addition to the cost impacts of our road design standards, there are environmental impacts. Here you see the same 3, apologies again, the print is small, the annual surface runoff generation. So when it rains or it snows and it melts, when you have hardscapes such as asphalt, largely the water cannot infiltrate into the earth and recharge our groundwater. It sheets off, it creates flooding, and as it sheets off and travels the landscape to water courses and water bodies and ultimately Long Island Sound, it picks up contaminants on the way and increases the contamination, the pollution of our waterways and water bodies. You can see that the generous road design standards, which are taken from one municipality in Connecticut, but they're not uncommon, produce 184% more runoff than the more conservative standards. And the conservative standards are taken from another municipality. More asphalt is not only more expensive and creates more runoff, it also creates higher summer temperatures through what's called the heat island effect. Anybody who's walked around a forest in the summer versus the middle of a blacktop can attest that is much higher over the asphalt. More asphalt also requires more maintenance, not just to repair potholes and repatch, more municipal expense, but also entails greater use of pre-icers and de-icers that ultimately befoul our waterways and our aquifers. And lastly, asphalt, at least historically and currently conventionally, its production is a very energy intensive process. It also uses a lot of oil. So there are greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. The less we can use, the better for the environment. Again, this is all being driven by our road design guidelines. One issue which was not raised earlier, but has become of increasing relevance this year as we've seen an energy cost crisis is the impact of street designs on energy use. Since the 1960s and 70s, the state has been aware of, although not pursued, what is called passive solar design. In a building, we are even with warmer temperatures in the summer, we are a heating dominated climate. That is, our energy needs in the winter far exceed our energy needs in the summer for cooling. To the right, you'll see an example of a subdivision that was redesigned so that the homes, so that their primary face or facade would face south. The windows would face south. The roof would face south, so the home could benefit from the insulation, that is the energy from the sun warming it up in the winter. The benefits of this are actually quite striking. Home that is correctly oriented, and home orientation is largely driven by street orientation. You can build a home sideways, but generally have the front door of a house face the street. When homes are properly oriented, you can see about a 20–25% reduction in the demand for energy to heat the building. And that addresses not only climate change and not only the cost of the building in terms of being able to have smaller heating systems, but also the cost of owning the building. Something we often forget. Utilities are becoming increasingly a burden for households in our state. The other advantage of having streets properly oriented, which street design guidelines can address, is that buildings that naturally harness the sun's energy are also more capable at converting the sun's energy into electricity through photovoltaic arrays. If your roof faces the correct direction, not only is your house naturally warmed in the winter, you also can generate more electricity and offset your energy costs. These benefits are compounded in super insulated homes. We've seen this year that the state has adopted the 2021 International Residential Code, increasing air sealing and insulation requirements for homes. Super insulated, more insulated homes see a disproportionate increase in the energy cost benefits of correct solar orientation. These are all things that streets can do. I would be remiss in not talking about street safety. Generally speaking, the wider, flatter, and straighter a street is, the higher speeds you'll have. It simply is easier to drive faster on streets that are wide, flat, and straight. Unfortunately, the faster you go means you not only have less time to react to something in the road, whether it's a pedestrian or another car or a dog, but you also do more damage to yourself and everybody else when you crash. And here you'll see, well, the prior chart showed the probability of a crash based on speed. This chart shows the fatality of it. You can see it's not linear. Once you hit a certain speed, the rate of death increases dramatically. That's why in many European countries, we've seen speed limits of 30 kilometers an hour, which is 18 miles an hour in residential streets. In some areas, they even have what are called Wohnelfen, which are streets where the traffic is regulated to walking speed and children can play safely in the street. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures about what we're talking about. This is a contemporary subdivision in Connecticut. And as you can see, the road that is the cul-de-sac is almost as wide as the main street. Interestingly, this is under current street design guidelines. There is a sidewalk around the cul-de-sac, a cul-de-sac of 3 homes, and there is no sidewalk on the busy main street. Again, here we have a street that I have actually measured this street. Yes, Leslie is absolutely right. Tape measures are great, except when you're measuring more than 25 feet. In that case, you might need a laser distance or some type of other tool to measure it. This street is 34 feet wide along the street, and the cul-de-sac's about 100 feet with the sidewalk on both sides and street lights. This is very expensive infrastructure to build, not just a sidewalk and street lights, but the asphalt there. For reference, lane widths on interstate highways are 11 feet. So we have a road that has no striping, but is as wide as 3 interstate highway lanes, and nobody parks on that street. Everybody has off-street parking. Here's another picture of the same street. You can see how small the car is in relation to the homes. Now, keep in mind, this is not being built by, generally speaking, by developers voluntarily. And there's probably not, homeowners are probably also not pressing for larger streets. This is governed by local design standards. Nobody is asking for this. And I would bet you that the homeowners, if they do walk on those sidewalks, they would probably prefer to have a slower street where sidewalks are not needed and they don't have to shovel a sidewalk. In contrast, here's a historic street, very low traffic street, no history of crashes, no history of fatalities. The street may not meet the standards of the Connecticut Highway Design Manual, but it is, in the common sense of the word, not a highway. It's a neighborhood street. And then you see the street that it opens onto. This street here is a historic street onto which a cul-de-sac was built. So the local design standards have required that the developer spend a small fortune building an extremely large cul-de-sac on the end of a dead-end road, where if there is a geometric choke point, it was the entrance. This is another photograph of it. You can see I-84 and the residential street to the right. This street is in a community that has very low incomes, where households presumably would have the least amount of income to pay for excess infrastructure, but it was built. In contrast, this is one of the highest income communities in the state. Now, these are private roads, but private roads are what are built by developers or neighborhoods when they are able to decide what to build. There is no history of houses burning down here. There is no history of people being run over by cars because the road is too narrow and there are no sidewalks. This is a neighborhood that is incredibly desirable, despite, or perhaps because the streets are narrow and inexpensive. Again, this is a street where I grew up. It's actually a collector. There's a good amount of traffic on it, and vehicles often block the street. Again, no history of any type of serious injury, fatality. This does not only apply to exurban and rural areas. We can see in other countries much more human scale streets in residential neighborhoods. Here you have a medium density residential neighborhood and multifamily housing. Still lots of auto use, but it is naturally calmed. And again, here's another one. This one is in Switzerland. Terrible sight lines, no sidewalks, but the street functions very well at relatively low cost with high environmental benefits. And lastly, higher density multifamily housing street. Again, this is a very desirable community. It's been studied by many urban planners. We haven't seen this replicate in Connecticut, but I don't see why we shouldn't have this. They'll probably sell like hotcakes. So that was a little show and tell about the importance of street design guidelines. If we're looking at making our communities safer, more sustainable, more diverse, more affordable places, street design guidelines are very important. Note that I'm saying street here and not highway. The guidelines we have for our interstates, our limited access highways, arguably our arterials, are in many cases good. And they've been tested nationally, and they're regularly updated. The same can't be said for how we design streets at the local level. We really need to look at this and figure out, can we do better? There are many examples out there. Can we develop a manual that is specifically for residential streets, access roads, and driveways that's based on objective implementation and reflects best practices past and present? Such a manual would apply to low-speed streets, to local streets, and it should consider a range of factors: safety and mobility of all users, environmental sustainability, the cost of construction and maintenance, community cohesion, which Leslie spoke so importantly about, land use, and utility accommodation. There are other factors that could be considered, for instance, light pollution, heat island effects, so on and so forth. All of these things could be achieved through renewed look at our street design guidelines. And that is my presentation.
Thank you, Francis. And I think this is, although people may say, you know, what does this have to do with a form-based code? But I believe the Public Act 2129 clearly identified as one of the 5 elements of this is creating a code manual for context appropriate streets that complement common building types. And when taken together with the concepts of a form-based code, you know, we're reducing the cost of development, as Francis pointed out, and provide for more livable streets that shouldn't just be reserved for private roads in Tony communities, but could be applied across the boards throughout Connecticut. So thanks again. with that, that concludes our presentation of our working group for 2022. And I thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Leslie and Francis, for those presentations. I do want to offer that if any of our members have any questions for the presenters, please utilize the raise hand feature in the Zoom, or anyone in the room have any questions? Sure, Representative.
Thank you so much. Under the provide funding to engage a consultant or multiple consultants to develop code guidelines for municipalities, is there any estimate yet as to what a consultant of that nature might cost?
Of course, it's going to be totally dependent on what the scope of work is. My knee-jerk response to that, after careful consideration, of course, would be, and I think we're in the range of maybe a couple $100,000. This is a long, remember what we're doing is somewhat unique here in that we're looking for a concept document that could be adopted by municipalities, so it needs to cover many different form types. And that's a little bit unusual than, say, Hartford developing a form-based code, or Avon developing a form-based code specific to its town. So it's got to work in Bridgeport or Waterbury or Farmington or Brookfield or wherever. So it's a little bit hard to gauge, but I feel that that estimate is accurate. And I think, back to some of our other recommendations, part and parcel of that is the adoption and the costs associated with the adoption. So being able to empower the state to assist municipalities if they should do some kind of granting process.
And I would just say, comment to that, as I represent a community that did adopt form-based code. My hope would be that at some point during that process with the consultant, that perhaps they would be able to look at the communities that have adopted it within Connecticut to then use those sort of as a feedback loop. Because I think that in Canton and specifically Collinsville, they've done it very successfully, and we're very proud of it. And it took a lot of years to get it done. But as you said, it doesn't necessarily work for other towns. But I think that if we're looking to the towns that have already successfully implemented it, that would be a really good thing to move forward with as part of the process and with a consultant. Thank you for the answer.
Thank you, Representative. Anika Lamar.
Hi, can you all hear me? Okay, so a couple of comments. First, I have a question about the statewide code that would be developed. Would towns have the ability to layer on top of that code? I mean, is the concept that the state would develop a kind of skeleton that towns could then layer on top of? I am deeply skeptical that it is worth a penny, much less multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, to develop a state form-based code intended to simplify and encourage certain kinds of development. But then what would happen to that code is that localities would kind of layer on top of it things that might make it unworkable. And I think we have good reason to believe that that's exactly what would happen. A second question on the street design presentation, which I found really helpful. Certainly not my area of expertise. The question that came up for me, though, in my mind, which is that, a lot of the housing demand today is in places that are already developed. We don't see a lot of new units coming on board as a result of brand new subdivisions. The presenter, pointed to a small subdivision in Waterbury as an example, but my sense is that the demand that exists is to build on existing streets. And I think from a street safety perspective, we have a ton of work to do. I live on one of those streets that maybe is a thoroughfare going through downtown New Haven, and there are safety issues, right, around that. But I guess I'm curious in terms of the empirics. what is the data around how much those street guidelines are really affecting housing costs when the development pressures that we're seeing are for units, new units on existing streets, not in brand new subdivisions on what was formerly farmland, let's say. Thanks.
Thank you, Anika. Do you want to, one of you want to do the first part about the layers by the towns on the state form-based, Leslie?
Sure. Perhaps I wasn't clear. I don't, and our working group did not see looking at this as a form-based code for the entire state. It's zoning codes are not a one size fits all in any way, even when you divide them by, rural to dense urban development. And so the idea is, and the gold standard for form-based codes now, in my opinion, is the Smart Code 9.2. And anybody can Google it. It's free. Any municipality can use it as long as they're for free. It's with attribution. It gives you the things that one should think about, that one should consider, and language that you can then massage. It still should be by municipality. It's a home rule state. Our home rule legislation requires that zoning regulations be done by municipality. So the idea is not to layer something over the entire state. I don't think Connecticut, I'm not sure anywhere is prepared for that. And Connecticut certainly isn't. We've got a lot of diversity. And the idea is to allow for that diversity in a way that is using that calibration for how each community works. Now, that there can be, people can circumvent that and do quote unquote bad things with that, but it is the tool, and it's the most local tool we can use to actually overcome that. I've never found a shortcut for grassroots organizing, and I don't think that zoning is the exception in any way. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Leslie. And Francis, do you want to comment on the street design, new development versus existing streets and the data and the housing costs question?
So yeah, there are a couple points I'd make. Yes, there is. We've seen demand shift in favor of multifamily housing and higher density housing, but that does not mean there is not also demand for single family housing, or we're not seeing single family housing starts. The primary problem that I've identified is that we have relatively good, not bad, we'll say at least, we have decent design standards for higher functional classification highway facilities, interstates, other limited access expressways, arterials more or less. We have neglected to look at the design standards for local roads, and municipalities, largely out of a concern of liability, have deferred to the state. They don't have the resources to create their own standards. If you're looking at an urban area with larger apartment buildings and mixed use, those would not necessarily be covered by local design standards. And they perhaps they should be looked at, but in many of those places, the roads are already built. It's not so much an issue. For more suburban, exurban, rural roads where there is infill development of building on green fields, vacant parcels, roads have a limited lifespan, 20 years, 25 years before they're reconstructed. Now, the scope of that reconstruction can vary, but if a municipality has a failing road, there is a decisional point about whether we rebuild and place what was already there, or we improve it when we rebuild it. And I can think of a couple examples where the municipalities took back some asphalt to improve, I shouldn't say improve the traffic flow, to calm the traffic flow on roads where there was pedestrian use. So, we have talked for years about how we should fix it first and focus on maintaining state of good repair. I think an important question at the same time is, should we put back what was there or should we change it? And I think that's a place where street design guidelines could apply in addition to new construction.
Thank you, Francis. Anika, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I did have a follow-up. Francis' answer on street design was quite helpful. I'm not convinced that this is a big driver of housing unaffordability in the state, but I take your point that this is important to other considerations that are spelled out in the statute authorizing this commission. I did have to jump back in. Connecticut's not a home rule state. I will concede that I'm not an expert on street design if the planners will concede that they're not lawyers. I'm happy to share. I had a student a couple years ago do a fact sheet on this, happy to share it. Not a home rule state, that term has meaning, and it does not apply to the state of Connecticut. As a sort of third point, as a voting member of the commission, I couldn't in good faith vote to recommend that the legislature authorize the expenditure of any money for a code that is unlikely to be adopted in any kind of healthy or helpful way by local governments. This state has spent quite a lot of money over the years and has authorized the expenditure of a lot of money over the years to try to coax towns to do the right thing. And I will not throw good taxpayer money after bad. We've been doing this. We've been trying this. It does not work. And I could not possibly vote for that. Thank you, though, to the subcommittee's work.
Thank you, Anika, for those comments. Are there any other comments or questions for the presentation? Okay, I am not seeing any others. Again, thank you very much to the committee and our presenters today. We'll note that the presentations will be posted. All of our documents are on the Connecticut General Assembly website under the Planning and Development Committee. So these presentations will be posted there for the members and the public. Moving on the agenda under business, submission of our 2023 legislative recommendations. As you know, at our last meeting, we did make recommendations to be submitted. Planning and Development Committee did do a raised concept bill, so thank you very much, Representative. I'm not sure where that stands at this point. If you have any updates that you can give us at this point.
I believe we're going to be having a public hearing, if that helps. At which point we're happy to take any testimony at that time.
Terrific. So, and as soon as we have bill numbers and everything on that, we'll get that out to everybody for that. We are continuing on track with our commission timeline. Next commission meeting, March 6th, which will be a presentation, municipal affordable housing plans, Representative Lamar and Tim Hollister. So we will be doing that. Before we move into public comment, is there any other business that anybody has? And seeing none, we do have one person registered for public comment. Delia Fay, Northeast Connecticut Council of Governments. And I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly.
Hello, I don't have any comments. I'm just here to watch.
Okay, thank you very much. With that then, it is 4:18 p.m. We can take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Thank you, Greg. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Representative. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you. Any opposed? Thank you all very much. Appreciate all your work. Have a good day.